Welcome back to Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. Back with me today is our senior analyst, Laurence Sanford.
Good day, Joy.
How are you, Larry?
Nice to be here.
Good. Normally we don't talk about China a lot with Canada. You don't really think that way too much, but well, recently with a spy balloon, I guess we can. So we are going to talk about China and Canada on Larry's latest article that he has out. Larry, want to brief us on that?
Well, China is following its typical playbook in its overseas actions. In other words, it's buying land like it's doing here in America. It's distorting the housing market in Vancouver, British Columbia, one of the most beautiful cities and natural settings of any city in the world. Chinese immigrants are coming in, buying up housing, which is driving the local residents out of the housing market. And the thing that makes it disturbing, especially to the Canadians, is most of the time these houses are vacant. They're vacant because the Chinese are back in China, and then they come over to Canada on occasion. But they also have an influence on political, and one of the things that happened in the recent election was the Chinese were very active in supporting those candidates that favor China and very active in opposing those who raise issues about the Chinese presence on land and the housing. The spy balloon is a good example. They also found, for example, Chinese boys up in the northern seas off of Canada. So China is becoming very aggressive in their political activities. And
that was an interesting thing. I did not know that when I read your article. So is the U.S. addressing these buoys?
I do not know. I just read that Canada found it. Well, it's Canada territorial waters, so the question is...
Are we addressing Canada on this issue?
Yeah, well, Canada is a close ally.
Yes, they are, and they're very close to us, so...
And in Canada, the Chinese in Canada are doing, again, the typical stuff they do. They're funding Confucius Institutes in the universities and the schools, and Confucius Institutes teach Mandarin and Chinese culture, but they also preach policies favorable towards China. So if you go to a Confucius Institute class and you try to bring up the issue of Tibet or the Tiananmen Square massacres or Hong Kong repression or the independence of Taiwan, you will not be allowed to discuss them. So they're really propaganda tools as far as promoting the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, agenda.
And the CCP is promoting this all across the globe with their Confucius Institutes, even though some have been closed down in the U.S. and Canada. But
well, the U.S., there were over 100 Confucius Institutes in America until the U.S. government told those institutions of so-called higher learning that if you're taking money from the Chinese for the institutes, we're not going to send you any money. So now there's only a handful of universities still with the institute. So.
And they're certainly propagating, as you said, they're making themselves, the CCP look good versus America or any other democratic nations.
And they're doing the same thing that they do here in the States. I mean, the Chinese subsidize the University of Penn Biden Center in Washington, D.C. They do the same thing up in Canada. They subsidize these institutes. They subsidize all these programs to make the Chinese have influence and access to influential leaders. But there's some playback going on. The Canadians are starting to clamp down a little bit, especially because of the recent revelations that the intelligence services of Canada have presented to the leadership, Trudeau, for the past few years, the dangers of China. And the recent elections and the expose of the shenanigans of the CCP causing a blowback. So Trudeau apparently said he's going to set up an inquiry into what's going on. It's a narrowly defined inquiry, and again, there's some blowback on that too, because he should be making it a more wider public inquiry, but he's not.
But thankfully there is some awakening to the CCP's, what they're trying to do there in Canada.
To me, the most important thing, it goes back to years ago when I was in a manufacturing organization. You have to identify the issue, and then you can fix it. So you have to identify that China is not our friend. China's, the CCP objective is world domination. And once you recognize that's their objective, you realize they're not our friends, and they should be treated very gingerly. And I'm not saying we should get into a war footing, but we should establish a program of reciprocity. If the Chinese won't allow us to do things in China, we should not allow them to do things in America or Canada. And the perfect example is TikTok and WeChat. They're poisoning our culture. They're swaying our young and old into policies favoring China. Yet China will not allow Facebook or Google to operate in China. I say if we can't operate in China, then Facebook and then TikTok and WeChat should not be allowed to operate here in America.
And the same could be said for the land grab situation as well.
Yes, precisely. Good point. I mean, Chinese can't own land, Americans can't own land in China. So if we can't own land in China, then the Chinese should not be able to own land in America. I listened to, I think it was the Federalist podcast hour. It was usually a terrific organization. They were talking about TikTok. Not once did they talk about the cultural influences that TikTok is promoting. All they talked about was the privacy issue, which is important. But to me, the most important issue of all is the fact that these organizations, TikTok and WeChat, are poisoning the culture. And that's, for that reason alone, they should be banned.
Again, propaganda using media platforms.
Yeah.
And we're also going to have a special guest coming up, and we'll talk about the fentanyl crisis as well, because they're pushing that on these as well.
Yeah.
And so, going back to the land situation, you said they're buying up a lot of land in Canada because they can't own their own land in China. Do you believe our northern border should be looked at a little bit more critically?
I think it is.
Okay, good.
I think actually there's more illegals coming down from Canada than in the past. Nothing compared to the southern border, of course, but yeah, it's more of an issue. But you know, Canada and the American border is the longest border in the world with no real barriers to it. So,
and the friendship we haven't really addressed that much of that.
There is a friendship, even though the United States invaded Canada 4 times. Oh well.
And we have a trade zone between us and Canada and Mexico.
It used to be called NAFTA, now it's called something else.
I can't remember what Trump renamed it either. So, peace through strength solution. Larry, what are your thoughts on countering the threat from China on both our northern and southern borders?
Well, the southern border is different because we're talking about millions of people, and we should definitely build a wall. I'm not advocating building a wall on the northern border, but we have to hope that the Canadians see the threat of people coming from all over the world, and I think they're tightening up on that also. Excellent. And then moving their way down into the United States. Ironically, I can remember reading where some of the illegal immigrants went to New York City and said, "Oh, we're going up to Canada." They came back within a month or two saying it's too cold. So I'm not worried about too many southern immigrants moving up to Canada. It's them coming down from Canada. It's cold up there.
And then they have fairly more social programs than we do.
Yes.
In that aspect. But I do hear just that a lot of Canadians will come to America for health care.
Yes, because of waiting list and any socialized program, it's great for the routine stuff. Well, maybe not so great, but it's there available free of charge. But if you want something like a hip replacement or something major, you're going to wait a long time. And so a lot of people say, well, I got the money, I got the insurance, I'm going to come to America. I remember when I lived in England for a while, they had the national health, but almost all people of means always had a backup insurance plan so that if they had something, they could go to a private doctor. So I think that's true in Canada too.
But again, around us, we're seeing a lot of socialism happening, social democratic, I guess you could call it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of countries are leading that way. Though on the other hand, just since we last talked on that subject, I see where Paraguay and Chile have just had elections that are going back against socialism, or Marxist leadership, in Chile in particular. So who knows, the tide might be turning back in our favor.
And maybe the Marxist is dying down to a more of a democratic socialism like we were discussing.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you, Larry, for your brief on Canada.
Yeah. And
to our listeners, you can read his article on www.ascf.us. subscribe to our newsletter so you can receive updates from that. Larry's also on Substack now, so you look us up on ASCF. Join us on Twitter and Facebook. Make sure you comment, please, and also subscribe to this YouTube channel as well as our Rumble channel by typing in American Security Council Foundation. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you to our listeners, and join us next time on Peace Through Strength podcast.